and welcome to the So Essential vlog. I'm Lucy and I'm here today to share a tutorial on how to French seam an armhole. So for anyone who doesn't know, a French seam is a technique where you cleverly encase the raw edges of the fabric within the seam itself. So it's a lovely finish that you'll often find on shirts, tailored shirts or garments where you really want that professional finish, and I'll just show you now what it looks like just in case anybody doesn't know. That is a French seam, so you can see all the raw edges of the fabric are encased within the seam itself. Now we have got a tutorial on our channel that shows you how to do a basic French seam, but today I'm going to show you how to do it in an armhole. And the good news is it's a lot easier than you think. It's not that complicated at all, so I'll take you through step by step exactly how to do it. Any tools or gadgets that I mentioned today are available on our website, and you'll find the links to our website and any of the tools or gadgets I mentioned today below. And if you like what you see today, please like and subscribe, because every Friday I bring a dose of sewing related goodness to our channel, so you'll be updated with that. So let's get started now with the tutorial. So here I have a little mock-up bodice I've made for the purposes of this video with some scraps of fabric. So it's not a full bodice, but I've got the correct armhole there, and I've sewn the side seams and the shoulder seams in the usual way and pressed those open. Obviously you could French seam those as well if you wanted to, but I haven't done that. I'm just showing you how to French seam the armhole. And then I've also sewn the sleeve seam as well on this little mock-up sleeve that I'm using. Now, if you were going to set in a sleeve the normal way, you would start with your bodice inside out and your sleeve the right way out, and you would insert the sleeve into the armhole. You would match up the shoulder seam right sides together and pin that in place, and then you would match up your other notches and your underarm seam and you would pin it in place right sides together. Now, when you want to do, a French seam, not a princess seam, you reverse it. So you turn the sleeve inside out, you keep your bodice the right side out, and you insert the sleeve, just drop that sleeve in the armhole, and then let's find the notch. Notches are really important for setting in your sleeves because you want to make sure you've got the ease in the correct position and the sleeve head in the correct position, so always be aware of that. And also, if you set a sleeve in the wrong way round, it will look incredibly odd. I know, because I've done it. We all make these mistakes from time to time. So I'm going to pin on the side of the sleeve, and I am matching wrong sides together like so. I'm pinning from the wrong side of the sleeve side rather than the body side, because that's where the fullness is going to be. So that's where I'm going to need to sew on the sleeve side, because you always want to sew on the side with the most fullness, because obviously you need to control that fullness and you need to ease it in to the shorter length of fabric on the other side. And it can be quite tricky setting in sleeves from that point of view, because you've got one piece of fabric, the bodice armhole will be shorter than the sleeve, where the sleeve joins the armhole, so it can be a little bit tricky. Some people prefer to use easing stitches or gathering stitches to sort of ease and shorten the length of the sleeve, but actually the method I was taught was just to ease it in as you pin and sew. So that's what I'm going to do today. But the first thing I'm doing is I'm just matching up the notches, getting those into position and correct, and just pinning those in place, as I said, from the sleeve side. Now I've done that, I'm going to continue, and I'm going to just, I call it bubble pinning. I don't know if there's a correct terminology for it, but I'm just going to create little bubbles in the sleeve fabric to help me to ease that fabric in as I sew. With this method, sometimes you might find you haven't quite distributed things the right way. You might have to go back and reposition things if you can't get all that fullness in. This is a fuller sleeve than I remember. I perhaps should have chosen one with a little bit less fullness in, but that's okay. We'll run with it. Because the other thing I'll always say as well with sleeves is, you know, if you do get any tucks in them as you sew, which happens to the best of us, you can always just unpick that little section and re-sew it if you need to. But I do find as well with a French seam armhole, because you're only sewing a 1/4 inch seam initially and then you're sewing a 3/8 seam, it almost helps you, I think, ease that fabric in a little bit better than when you just have to sew a 5/8 seam straight away, because you know it doesn't feel like you're easing quite as much fabric in because you're doing it in 2 steps. I don't know whether that's right, but that's how it always feels to me. So I'm just going to carry on and pin the sleeve in, wrong sides together, just easing that fullness in. Now you may notice there's a lot more fullness on the front of my sleeve than there is on the back. This is because of an adjustment that I make, because I've got a forward shoulder and I have got a lot more fullness in the front of my shoulders than the back. I need more fullness in that area. But there we go, we're all pinned and ready to go across to the sewing machine and sew that first seam, which we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I'm just positioning the sleeve underneath the machine foot, and I'm using the 1/4 inch marking on my machine foot. I've got the sleeve on top and the bodice underneath, and I'm just lining everything up with that 1/4 inch marking, and I'm going to start at the underarm seam. And that's because it's nice and easy there. There's no easing of fabric that needs to happen, and it's also, you know, the least noticeable place, so it's a good place to start stitching. I've just back tacked to secure everything, and I've got my needle down, and I'm just positioning everything now. And this is a really good tip when you're sewing in sleeves. You know, do be prepared to move things around and manipulate and maneuver the fabric as you go around the armhole, because when things go wrong, it's when things aren't lying flat on the needle plate. So, and I'm just going to use my purple thang as well, and that will help me to ease the fabric through. So I've put a link to this below for you, but you can watch as I get to the point where I've got to start easing fabric through. I can use the stiletto end of this purple thang to help me ease that fabric through. But I'm using up down, needle up down on my machine as well. If you've got that facility, it just means you can stop with your needle in the down position, and then you can manoeuvre the fabric as you need to, and that's really useful to be able to do when you're setting in sleeves. It's just so important that everything's lying flat and everything's in the correct position so that you can avoid those tucks that you might get sometimes. I'm just using my purple thang to just slide those pins out as well, and just sewing with that 1/4 inch seam with the wrong side of the fabric together, manoeuvring everything as we go along so that everything's in the correct position, it's hanging properly, it's lying nice and flat. Because if you think about it, you know, when things go wrong, it's when you're attaching the 2 pieces of fabric together in the wrong place. So I'll just carry on stitching around there. We're starting to get towards some of the areas where the ease needs to be sort of eased in and sewn in as we go around the fuller part of the sleeve. So you can just watch me do a couple of those sections with the purple thang. So I'm just using it there to just push the fabric through so that we don't get any tucks, and the fabric, the bigger piece of fabric can be sewn to the bodice without any tucks or gathers. So I'm just easing that through again. You can see it just makes it nice and easy using this purple thang. It's such a great little tool, so inexpensive but so useful. And I'll just whiz through this last bit. I don't want you to have to sit and watch me sew the entire thing, but you've got an idea of the techniques I use now. And then I've just come to the end here, so I'm just going to back tack everything to secure there, match those lines of stitching up, and there we have it. We've sewn the first 1/4 inch seam, wrong sides together, and you can see that fabric's been eased in nicely there. So that's the first step completed. Okay, so here we've sewn the sleeve into the armhole with a 1/4 inch seam, And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press it flat first of all, and then I'm going to press the seam open as well. Now when I'm doing this, I'm going to use probably my seam roll or sleeve roll, and also my pressing ham. We sell these on the website. They're absolutely invaluable tools for not just this sewing task, but lots of other sewing tasks. They just make pressing a lot easier and getting into the little nooks and crannies a lot easier. So I'll show you how I use those when I do this pressing. But first of all, I'm just pressing the seam flat just to meld the stitches and just smooth everything out. So I can just do that on the ironing board, and I'm just going to work my way round the armhole, pressing it so the fabric is sort of gathered where I've eased it in. And just as you go round, just check there's no tucks, but there isn't on mine. I've managed to ease it all in successfully, which was great. But like I said, if you do find that you've had any issues there and you've got any little tucks, just unpick that little section. Make sure you secure everything, so you back stitch, you know, at the start of the stitching and the end of the stitching, but you can just unpick that little section and re-sew that little section if you need to. So we've done that, we've pressed that nice and flat, and now I want to press this seam open as well. So this is where my tailor's ham comes in. These are great for when you're pressing sleeves and things, because you can position the sleeve head over the end of the ham like so, and that enables you to press really well. It just makes such a difference being able to do that. So if you can just see that there, it really does help, and it means you can press on the body side rather than the sleeve side, so you're not pressing the fullness out of the sleeve as well. And you can turn it on its side, you know, and work with it like that. The sleeve roll as well is really handy, particularly when you're sewing sleeve seams. You just insert it inside the sleeve like so, and then if I'd just sewn that sleeve seam there, I'd be able to press along there nice and easily rather than trying to do it flat on the ironing board. And again, I can just use this to manoeuvre along here as I press the seams open. For example, I might want to use the sleeve roll here, so I'll just press the seam open all the way along the armhole. Okay, so you can see I've pressed that seam open all the way around the sleeve, and then what we're going to do is take that out, and then we want to keep the sleeve inside the armhole, but we're going to press along that seam line there. So we want to line it up so the seam line's running across the top there, and then we're going to press that flat, because this is where we're going to sew our next seam, and it probably is starting to take shape and make sense now. We'll be sewing a 3/8 seam along that edge there. The fabric is now right sides together, and it will encase the seam that we initially sewed inside that seam allowance, because the initial one was 1/4 of an inch and this one's going to be 3/8 of an inch, so it'll encase all of that in there. You'll end up with a seam line running round here somewhere, and then when you turn it the right way through, your sleeve will be sewn to your bodice right sides together, but then on the inside everything will be neatly encased, and that's your lovely French seam finish. So I'm just going to go ahead and press everything now before I pin it into place. Okay, so we've pressed that now nice and flat, and if you notice I was only ever pressing inside the seam allowance because, as I said, you don't want to flatten that sleeve head, especially if it's a pattern with a bit of ease. The sleeve is supposed to have a bit of volume sometimes, so I was just pressing just in the seam allowance, and I'm going to pin that into place now ready for sewing. But what you will find is there'll be a lot less ease to pin in this time, because you've already worked a lot of it out with that initial seam allowance. So this is what I was saying earlier, that I think in some respects, although it's more time consuming certainly than setting in a sleeve the traditional way, it actually in some ways kind of makes it a little bit easier, because it allows you to gradually ease that fabric in rather than having to do it all in one go. So I'm just going to pin that into place, and then we'll take it over to the sewing machine to sew the final seam. Okay, so that's all pinned into place. Again, I've pinned it from the sleeve side, because that's where any ease is going to be, and then I'll just be able to be in control of that as I sew that into place. So I'm just bringing the fabric across to the machine here, and I'm going to position it under the foot in the same way as we did the previous seam. So I'm sewing from the sleeve side, not the bodice side. And this time I'm going to use the 3/8 of an inch marking on my seam guide foot, because I want to encase that seam that we've just sewn and the raw edges as well. I'm using my purple thang again just to pull out those pins and just to ease the fabric through, but to be honest, there isn't a lot of fabric to ease through on this row of stitches, because you've already done most of it on the previous row of stitches. And then I'm just manoeuvring the fabric, getting everything nice and flat like I did before, trying my best to keep the visibility good for you guys as well. It's a bit tricky sometimes, but I'm doing my best there. Back tacking to secure, and then I'm just going to sew that 3/8 seam, and this will encase everything that we've already done. And again, just using that needle down position, even if you haven't got needle up down on your machine so you can't select where the needle stops, you can manually do this. Just you know, turn the hand wheel and just keep your needle down when you need to reposition the fabric, and it'll just help you to be able to do that without things moving. So I'm just going to whiz through that in the same way that I did the previous line, join everything up at the end, back tack to secure, and then just cut the threads. And there we have it. We have sewn a French seam in an armhole. So it's nice and neatly finished there. You can see it looks beautiful. All the raw edges are encased within the seam. It's a lovely professional finish. You would need to give it one last press, obviously, just to get everything looking really super neat. And that's what I would recommend, just give it another good press. Pressing is absolutely key for that professional finish. But you can see it's all beautifully encased, and that's it. So I do hope you've enjoyed the tutorial today, and it's demystified that technique for you, hopefully giving you some other tips and techniques that you might be able to use in your dressmaking as well. As I mentioned at the start of the video, any of the tools and gadgets I mentioned, I've popped links to those below, and there's also a link to our lovely website below as well. And if you like what you see, please like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.